How to write service objects in Ruby. In this video, I will show you step by step how to write service object in your Ruby on Rails project. I will explain what's the purpose of service object and how I write the service objects, what are some important pieces about writing the service object, and we also write some very simple tests so you can have like general overview how to test service objects. So let's wonder, like, what's the purpose of service objects? Basically, you want to, like, the primary thing you want to put into service object is some business logic in your application. For instance, let's say you are creating a new user in database and you need to sign up this user to newsletter, maybe send some welcome email, or create some statistic information in Google Analytics or in some external API. So there are a lot of steps associated to the process of creating user. And we would basically put some business logic, all those business dependencies into the service object. So we'll have one place when everything related to process of creating user is just sitting there. So maybe let's start with going to the console, and we could just write some class, right? Let's call it user creator. So the first thing is how to name the service, because service object is just a representation of some process. We typically name it with ending something like creator, or maybe updater, or maybe some authorizator, or there is some kind of process in your application, in your business logic. So you want to like represent this process name in the class name for this service object. So let's say we have this user creator, and the next step, what I do, just constructor, right? So define initialize method. So we have initialize method, our constructor. Another thing, we want to just be able to execute, just run this service object. So the default convention is to just use the name call, which is like the default name for the method in Ruby that's responsible for just executing some process onto object. And now we can wonder we could like distinguish two things. One thing is we want to create user, so we need some data, we need some information. Based on those data, we are going to create the user. So those are kind of input data, and we get those data from maybe from some web form on your website, or maybe our service is getting those data from some another service, or maybe from kind of different source. So we have the input data. In case of Ruby on Rails application, when we have some form, those data would come just from the form, and it would be in params. So we could pass params to our call method. So that's great. We have this one thing. Another thing is our service could use some other services. Maybe it uses some library or some classes from some gem you use. And those are dependencies needed to fulfill our process. So those dependencies goes to the constructor. Let's say while we are creating the user, we also need to send some statistic to Google Analytics. So we could say GI API here, stands for Google Analytics API. What else we could do? Maybe what we could else do? Okay, we are creating user. We are going to send those data to Google Analytics API. maybe, I don't know, let's send also some data to Mixpanel statistic dashboard. So Mixpanel API. And now in constructor we need to just set instance variables for that. So GI API, and the same for Mixpanel. And another thing I like to do is define attribute reader for those instance variable. Okay, and what's the purpose of that? Basically, we want to define those instance variable once in the constructor, and we don't want to like redefine them later. We want to have like access to those objects, Google Analytics API and Mixpanel API. So we can have this access just via methods, Ruby methods, because we want to like communicate with our objects using messages, and those messages are just method calls. So that's great. Now we can do, oh yeah, another thing that's important in case of the service objects is that it represents the process. It represents some process, and what's important, this process is like stateless. So there are some data coming from the user, which are data from some web form, and those data are in params. And we have some dependencies, which is this Google API and Mixpanel API. And we need to use both of those stuff to do some calculations, do something with them, and then just output some results. And what we would like to avoid is having some internal state that can change over time inside of the service object. The purpose of the service object should be to do one thing, just to follow the single responsibility rule, and just process some input data and do some output, but don't preserve the state, some state inside of this service object. Thanks to that, if we want to preserve this state, we will be able to multiple time reuse the service object. So let's say, okay, we create this user in our database. Let's say we have user model in our application. We do some create, and we could create user based on email, let's say. Maybe let's create some name for this user as well. We create this user. Now we use method to access Google Analytics API, and let's say we are sending some event. Let's say user created, and here we can pass some data. Let's say we pass all the params. Same story for Mixpanel. Let's say. Yeah, let's say interface looks the same. So yeah, here it goes. We have this business logic inside of our service object. We have this call method. And what else? Our logic can be more complicated, right? Maybe we need to prepare some data. Let's say we store in our database user first and last name just in the field called name. But in our params we would get first name and last name. Okay, so it's going to be a bit more messy here, not that readable as it was. So we could think about extracting some private method that would help us build the name, let's say name method that would take params, and and just prepare the name based on first and last name. So it could be something like that. And important thing here is that we just pass the params as argument to the private method name, and this is like more functional approach. What some other people could do, they could do like, oh, maybe let's say set some global like instance variable, and then we don't have to pass anything to name method. We could just use instance variables here, right? But I try to avoid that because this approach is kind of like avoiding object-oriented programming, because now you treat this params instance variable as a kind of global variable inside of this object. You just set temporary data onto this instance object in order to use those data in some other private method. And why this is like not the recommended way, in my opinion, is because now you kind of preserve state inside of the service object, which I was talking about earlier, that I'm not recommending doing something like that. You can easily imagine that someone could, oh, maybe let's expose this params outside of object, like let's make a public attribute reader for params. And now, let's say we would have some controller. Let's say we will have some user controller and class user controller, and we would have some action create, and here we would call user creator new. Here we are going to pass our dependencies, Mixpanel API. We have instance of our service, and we call our service with params, right? And someone could do some bad thing like, oh, let's extract params from inside of the service object, and this would be like extracting the current state of the service object, and the service object should not preserve some state because it should be kind of stateless. It should get some data, process, give you output, and it could be like reusable multiple times. So this is just bad approach. Get rid of it and go back to the previous example, like more functional example. We have just private method name that gets the params argument, extract some data from this argument, and create what we want, which is full name of the user. Oh, maybe this would be even better name, full name. So we have something like that. Okay, what else? We could now think about something more complex. Let's say there's one thing I really like to do often when I write service objects, which is I create kind of builder method, like it's a class method onto our service. So define self. Let's call it maybe just call. It would be like default builder on this service object, and the purpose of this builder is to fulfill the dependencies, and our dependencies are Google Analytics API and Mixpanel API. So we create a new instance of our service, we fulfill those dependencies, and those dependencies could be some They are sitting somewhere in our application. So here we need instance of Google API. So let's say there is a class called Google Analytics. API. We create a new instance of this API, and the same for Mixpanel new. So we fulfilled those dependencies of our service object by passing them to the constructor, and then we call method, our default method call to just run our service. And here we pass params, and those params need to be provided to our builder method. And what this allows us is, thanks to this, we can much easier use this service inside of our user controller, instead of here fulfilling the dependency, because here we had to pass our dependencies like Google Analytics and Mixpanel, and only then onto the instance of service object we could call our default method call with the params. So instead of that, we can just use our builder method, which is call, and just pass params. And thanks to that, using this service object is much easier, because you just use it. And also testing of that is much easier, because when you will write tests, you will basically, maybe let's write some example for the test here. Let's say this will be some RSpec. Okay, maybe let's do another file, spec directory, user controller spec RB. And we're going to test user controller, and we are going to write test for action called create, and we will have a test that just calls create method, pass some params. Let's say we have some params here like email, name, example.com, first name, and last name. Okay, and now when you write test for such controller, you can mock those. You can mock this service object, and you can write something like expect user creator service should receive call method, our builder method with the params. We could extract those params here. Maybe like params, and instead of writing it here, we could just set our params here, and pass them here. So we expect that service object will be called with params, and let's assume that what we can do. Let's say after creating user, you will be rendering some welcome message, and to render this welcome message, we need what we need. Maybe the name of the user, right? So let's say we want that our service object would return instance of created user in database. So we return the instance of the created user in database. We could write it like that, and we could set some instance variable that's needed in our Rails view to show welcome message for this user. Oh, actually, it will be just like that. So here we could write some. We could just mock that our service would be called with call method with params, and it would return some user. So let's say user. It could be some fake user, and yeah, and basically that's it. Some people in RSpec long time ago, I guess it's not popular anymore, were writing some tests that check that controller sets some instance variables, but I believe it's no more popular approach to test something like that. Okay, so yeah, so as you can see, this is just quick way to write the test. It's just a few lines of code. Now imagine how it would look if this would be more complex, and by more complex I mean if you would have to just create the instance with those dependencies which are here. So let's say if we would not use the build method code, which is this class method on the service, if we would not use it, then we would have to just fulfill the dependencies, which is Google Analytics API and Mixpanel, into our constructor, and then call our method. So it will be a bit more writing here. But then testing would be a bit more complex, because you would have to write here that our user creator actually receives constructor method with those two instances. But we would have to mock those instances as well. So let's say we would have to write something like expect Google Analytics API should receive new method, and this would return Google Analytics API. Here we could create some fake API. Let's say that we could use instance double to make sure that we have some fake object that represents this class. And the same would be for Mixpanel. So Mixpanel API also should receive constructor and return some fake Mixpanel API. Let's resize this so it will be more readable. And we need here. Okay, sorry, I messed up. Once again, this should go here. Mixpanel here, and here it should be just like that. Okay, so we have this instance double for Mixpanel class. Then we expect Mixpanel API to receive a constructor and return instance of Mixpanel API. Then we can write that our user creator should receive a constructor with those dependencies, which is Google API and Mixpanel API. And then we return instance of our user creator. So we need user creator. Then we need to define this instance here. So instance double user creator. and then on this instance of user creator, we can expect to receive call method, which is instance method, with params, and we return some user. Let's move this user down. Yeah. So as you can see, there is like more writing in tests because you need to mock match more stuff here, and yeah, just more writing. So the simpler version was the previous one, when you just call the builder method, which is class method call on our service when you want to use the service in the user control. So let's go back to this more smooth and faster way of writing and of just using the service object. And another thing that's important and that kind of would make you think why to even write this builder method is that we could use our service with different dependencies. By dependencies, I mean all those stuff that goes to our constructor. Let's say that you would like to use our service with some different API for Google Analytics and some, I don't know, different Mixpanel API class. So let's say you have another builder method that will how we could call it, let's say build for I don't know, build for I don't know, maybe Facebook or something like that. Let's say our application is tracking statistics into Facebook because we need to track how many users were created, and we need this to better to help us with buying ads on Facebook, and we want to have some synchronization between amount of user in our database created thanks to the Facebook ads or something like that. And let's say we not only want to send data to Facebook, let's say. So here we could call Facebook API, and what else? Facebook API. Maybe Facebook API. Yeah, okay, maybe let's go like to the full point. The point is like, if you provide here instance of some object that would have exactly the same behavior, by behavior I mean the same public interface, the public methods, those this Google API object here has some public methods. In our case, we use public method like send event. So actually, you could provide pass here any instance that has method send event, and this method takes two arguments, some string and some hash params. If you provide some instance that will have this public method, then this service can be reused with this instance. So let's say maybe this name Google API is very strict, very precise, that we assume that our service works only with Google API. But we could make it more generic. So maybe like try to refactor this code, and we could just get rid of this name Google Analytics. Let's call it stats API, some statistics API. And just to make it maybe more simple, let's get rid of this mix panel stuff. So we get rid of mix panel. Mix panel is not needed here. And maybe instead of Google, let's assume we are buying ads also on LinkedIn. So we have some LinkedIn API, and we could call this method build for LinkedIn. So we have a service user create. This service takes some dependency, which is stats API. As a process that we want to represent in the service, we want to create user in database, and we want to send stats to the to some API, our stats API. And our application will handle two processes. Let's say user created account because he came from Facebook ads. He saw some AdWords advertisement on the Facebook, so he visited our website and then he signed up. So we want to track where this user came from. If it came from Facebook, we will send some analytics data to Facebook that the user was created. Another case, business case, is that user saw our advertisement on the LinkedIn. He visited our website and created account. So we want to create this account here. And as a second step, we want to send analytics data to LinkedIn. So we want to use this service object in two contexts, in context of Facebook and in context of LinkedIn. And with builders method, we can do that because we can have method for the LinkedIn and pass here LinkedIn API, or another case for Facebook, we pass Facebook API to our constructor. So as long as both instances of Facebook API and LinkedIn API are supporting public interface, public method called send event with two arguments, as long our service would work. And yeah, so those builder method can be used for this purpose. You have a very clean code for your service, for your business logic, and your dependencies are extracted. Like what exactly class you use for your dependency is extracted outside of the service. It just sits in the builder method. Yeah, so in user controller, you could have something like if params at source Facebook, then you would call build for Facebook, otherwise build for LinkedIn. Yep, so this is like very simple example. You can argue now that, oh, maybe detecting whether this user came from Facebook or from LinkedIn, those conditions are kind of business logic. Maybe we should put them into the service as well, or maybe not. So it depends on your context, what you would like to do in your application. Yeah, but this like general idea. This is like a few ideas I like to use when writing service objects in Ruby and extracting some business logic into services in Ruby on Rails application. So I think so far this works nice for me. You can try it on your own. Maybe you have different ideas, or maybe write your own service objects in totally different way, or maybe slightly different way, or maybe some of the stuff you have better idea how to handle. So feel free to share and write comment. Yeah, so thank you for watching. You can also find some other videos, mostly about testing, about Ruby, about JavaScript or Cypress testing, or just testing in JavaScript. And mostly you can find a lot of stuff about CI parallelization. You can check the website knapsackpro.com, which is tool I work on for splitting your Ruby tests across parallel CI nodes, parallel jobs to run your tests much faster. So check it out. You can also check the blog where is a lot of articles about multiple CI tools and how to write tests to run them really fast. So you can check that as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I would love to hear your feedback. Just write down below. Thank you again. See ya.